So, it is my pleasure now to introduce to you all Michelle Walker, who will share a few informal words of reflection with us based on her commitments and experience of the importance of giving shape to the work of race equity in education. Michelle, I'm going to have to change what I'm about to say a little bit quickly, because I had assumed that Michelle had her EDD confirmed this summer, and she informed me that no, there's just a few months left. To which my comment is, what are you waiting for? Come on. It'll be my distinct pleasure to be able to refer to Michelle, in addition to Michelle, as Dr. Walker. She is the Executive Director of Generation Next, a nonprofit coalition of civic, business, and education leaders focused on closing the gaps of educational outcomes that painfully exist in our Twin Cities region. Previously, Ms. Walker served for 3 years as Chief Executive Officer for the St. Paul Public Schools, where she held leadership positions for 9 years. She also had worked with the District of Columbia Public Schools. She is a Cornell grad and received 2 master's degrees, and her EDD is coming from the same institution. This will be an EDD in Education Leadership from the Teachers College at Columbia University. Please warmly welcome Michelle Walker.
So good morning to you. Thank you all for being here this morning and for being part of this very important conversation about race and equity in our state. When Carlos asked me to share some thoughts with you, I enthusiastically said yes. And then he used the word keynote. And I was like, what? you want me to do what? And what I really reflected on was I would be absolutely honored to be in a crowd of like-minded individuals who are committed to doing the real work. The educators who are in the room, the board leaders, the legislators, the community partners who have been engaged in this work before equity became the buzzword, before culturally responsive teaching became what everybody was doing, people who knew and understood the importance of doing this work. And so absolutely I said yes, I wanted to be in this room with people who were putting in the time to make real change. But upon deeper reflection, I actually grew frustrated that this conversation is still necessary, that we still have to fill auditoriums, and we still have to have conferences talking about race equity and the need for it. I've shared with some of you that I got into the profession of education after becoming aware of an organization in Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up, that was successfully serving at-risk boys in the late 90s. I'm sorry to say that as a whole, the prospects for young black men have not improved in the 20 years since I entered the field of education. So I wondered, what could I add to our understanding of a problem that has already been well-defined and solutions are already being tested by MnEEP? I still struggle with your new name, sorry, with MnEEP and other critical partners. So what I'm not going to do today is further define the problem. We know gaps exist, they are too wide and narrowing far too slowly, if at all. The fact is that if every child, every person in our state had all the opportunities that were due to them from cradle to career for them to reach their highest potential, none of us would be here. I do want to speak to the wisdom, however, of some of the solutions shared in MnEEP's 2016-17 annual report and reflect on what I've learned is necessary both personally and professionally to lean into MnEEP's big, bold goals. I want you to know that successes are possible, though they may be incremental, and I want you to know that there will be sacrifices. I still remember clearly a day when our cabinet at St. Paul Schools sat around our conference table talking about the realities of what could and would happen to truly interrupt institutional racism. when someone said that we had to come to terms that if we really wanted to do this work well, some of us would no longer be around the table. I have to tell you that today, I'd say about half of those people are around the table. I'm one of them that's not around the table, maybe fewer. But I also have to tell you that the sacrifices made by those people formerly leading St. Paul Public Schools pale in comparison to the sacrifices people of color are making across our nation every day. Still, they are sacrifices, and you need to be prepared as you walk in this journey on this work. So I draw from my experiences both in my former role as a chief officer of St. Paul Schools, where I would say I had my most profound learning on racial equity, and now in my role as an executive director of Generation Next, where I have the opportunity to have a wider, broader geographic and systemic scope. My reflections today resonate most clearly upon examination of MnEEP's Big Goal 1 and Big Goal 2, as explained in the annual report. So I'll speak to each of those. First, Big Bold Goal 1. Minnesota schools are culturally responsive in their policies and practice. As MnEEP and others have found in areas around Minnesota, St. Paul schools found through extensive research and data that controlling for income, Black and brown students would perform at predictably lower rates academically than their white peers. And we wanted to interrupt that reality. As I reflect on how we approach this work, I realized that while we eventually got to the policy level, the work actually began on the front end before the policy was crafted. And I think that helped us in two ways. First, our experience on the ground helped inform the realities of the policy itself. And we created, I believe, one of the first and unfortunately still one of the few district-level racial equity policies in the state and country. When we created the plan, we weren't projecting or guessing about what was possible. We wrote a plan that actually reflected some of the experiences of the existing work that was happening in the system. Secondly, once we got to the policy level and brought it to our board leadership, we had real-life experiences and challenges and issues and results that we could point to about why that policy was necessary. The policy wasn't rhetoric and dreams, but actions with results, even if those actions weren't always positive, and the results were few. They were real, and they could not be ignored or denied. So armed with the experience, when we approached our board, I believe our board listened hard, eventually realizing that for that effort to have real teeth, they too needed to be a part of the effort. And because of the pre-work we had done, our board understood that the school district's commitment and involvement had to be on all levels, from the boardroom to the classroom. And like MnEEP's work in the Mille Lacs region, the then St. Paul Public Schools Board of Education boldly engaged in their own racial equity training so that they could govern from an informed perspective. As the district approached the work itself, we attempted a cascade approach with intense training first at the leadership with the superintendent and the cabinet, then with our building administrators, and finally to school staff. But in hindsight, I think that the top-down model probably meant that that lag between the leadership level and the classroom level was a little too long, allowing for resistance to build during that cascade. So what I would recommend, instead of incorporating a model that involves what I would recommend instead is to incorporate a model that activates from the bottom up and the top down at the same time. And I know that's some of the work that MnEEP is looking at doing in the regions where it's working. Different staff levels are then given an opportunity to evolve concurrently and even inform one another, because as we started to engage together, we learned a little bit more about each other's perspectives. So again, I applaud MnEEP for the work that's beginning in Mille Lacs at the board level, and also encourage you to continue to work with all the members of the community as you've started, and to build those coalitions at the same time. Because the effort may be slower, but it's definitely going to be deeper in terms of its impact. I also encourage MnEEP to continue to help its partners to keep an eye on the second part of your big, bold goal, one, which is practices, not just the policies. Policies are wonderful and absolutely necessary for defining the work and goals, but policies rest on paper. Practices are flesh and blood, requiring action and implementation. Policy is only the beginning. Practices require putting the infrastructure in place to make those policies come to life. It's where we evolve into actions like hiring, staffing, performance evaluations, and monitoring and reporting on progress. We have some great success at St. Paul schools by reporting quarterly and annually on our balanced scorecards about the benchmarks that we as a community said we committed to see progress. And again, while that progress wasn't fast enough, we were able to have real and transparent conversations with our community about where we were. And I know this is part of MnEEP's plan around the equity cards and conversations about reporting. And I would encourage our communities as you engage to really be deeply committed to doing what you say you're going to do and being honest about when that's working and when it's not. Let's move from Big Bold Goal 1 to Big Bold Goal 2. Minnesota's school climates foster positive student engagement. This goal means so much to me personally because I saw it play out with the organization I worked back in Brooklyn, and I see it play out today, and I saw it play out time and time again at St. Paul schools. The behaviors we see in the classroom are a direct result of the environments that we create in those classrooms. And if a student walks into a classroom with an environment of high expectations, where they feel valued by their teacher, where they're stimulated to think, they are more likely to be engaged and less likely to act out. If they feel safe in a classroom, not invisible, but also not hyper-visible, students are more likely to be engaged and, again, less likely to act out. And when students do act out, I've found that in the majority of cases, while the student does have a role, so does the responsible adult, usually by escalating the situation instead of de-escalating and resolving the event. What occurred in SPPS as we worked to transform our schools, cultures to be more engaging, and all students being part of that school climate, we saw that school climate actually became the poster child for resistance against racial equity. In the face of requiring to relinquish our power as adults, culturally unaware people would conflate race and school climate, demanding safer schools when what they really wanted was whiter schools, or schools where Black and brown students were diminished or less than. They knew that few could spurn requests for safety. Who doesn't want safe schools? But safety to them meant disproportionate suspensions of Black and brown children, or exclusion of special education students, or fewer resources to Black and brown students. They called it safer schools, or enhanced school climates and culture. What they meant was keep those Black and brown kids under control. Safety was a code word for anti-equity.
Talking right.
Though people were aghast at that. I'm not racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. And I'm not saying all of this to ridicule folks who are really struggling with real life situations. What I'm asking and encouraging us all to think about and prepare ourselves for are the code words, for the language that represents resistance, for it's certain to come. The human animal is not programmed to relinquish power. And race equity work is about changing the power dynamics that have existed in this country for centuries. When St. Paul Schools began its racial equity training, the trainers told us, they warned us that we would meet with resistance. They even gave us an approximate time when it would come, and they were spot on. And still we were surprised, but more importantly disappointed. We couldn't believe that equity could be so twisted and co-opted. But change is hard. It's harder still when there's fear, and harder yet again when someone has to give up power, even if it's for the greater good. The good news, there's no better way to combat resistance than through authentic engagement, and mostly engagement of our youth. Be willing as teachers, as leaders, as administrators to first take a good hard look at yourselves and the role you play in the interactions with youth of color. Then find ways to actively engage and hear the student voice. And it's kind of like lawyers. Don't ask a question if you don't want to hear the answer. So don't engage our youth if you're not ready to respond to what they have to say. Find ways to amplify the student voice because they have the answers. If we think about all great movements, think about the placement of youth. Think about the role that youth played in starting and maintaining those movements. Create real environments for student engagement and leadership. Again, nothing works better to combat resistance than youth and truth. I want to congratulate MnEEP on its history of work and progress on behalf of youth of color in Minnesota. I encourage you to continue to elevate the conversations locally and across the table. And as a former St. Paul administrator, I remember the conversations we had around solutions, not suspensions, and how engaged our youth were in that conversation. And unfortunately, how unwilling some of the adults in that conversation were to respond. So we have to think about the environments that we're creating, and we have to think about what our youth are really saying and ask ourselves, are we prepared to answer? Generation Next and its partners will continue to amplify both the problems and the solutions. We will use data to spotlight best practices and convene the right people to better tackle the problems. In my new role, I'm excited about the partnership with MnEEP, and I think that we have more opportunities to do even more things together. We count on organizations like MnEEP to share new ideas, experiences, and contacts. I'm grateful to bring the experiences in the public school environment to Generation Next, where I have an opportunity to sit in the room with CEOs, heads of corporate philanthropies, county folks and school folks, and really think about the systemic approach to our problems. And we're working to determine the role that community, the broad community, can have in supporting education and success. I take such heart in the work that you all are doing here at MnEEP, and I'm grateful to stand beside you. I'm grateful to be in a room with all of you committed to this work. You know as well as I do, that our students are truly our future. This touches me on a very personal level, not just because of the work that I've done in education, because I have the honor of raising 2 young Black children, one of whom is, some of you who've met my children know that my daughter's a little bit of a mini me, which is great for other people, not so much for me. And my beautiful Black boy, who I literally, every single day, I put on my armor and I prepare for him not to live the statistics that so many Black boys do. So, again, I thank you for the work that you're doing, and I encourage you, I implore you, I beg you to continue to do more, better, faster, smarter, so that my Black boy doesn't become a statistic and so many Black boys don't become a statistic, and that our children of color are really armed with the tools for success. Because of the work that you all are doing, I am hoping that the world will be ready to receive my sweet baby boy, my sweet baby girl, and the hundreds and thousands of sweet baby boys and girls across our country. Thank you.